The Time War is one of the most defining events in all of the Doctor Who mythos, and was arguably a key factor behind the revival's success, creating a new status quo that allowed for new arcs and stories to be told. But what if this key defining event in Doctor Who history was changed? Welcome to Doctor Who Alternate History, the show where I use my best knowledge to determine what things could have been like if events played out just a bit differently. But before we get into it, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. We're trying to get to 15,000 subscribers as quickly as possible, so any help you could give the channel would be greatly appreciated. Now I'll be honest, trying to concoct a scenario in which the Time Lords and Daleks don't eventually come to blows is extremely difficult for a few reasons. The first one being that the war has retroactively been threaded back through so much of the show's continuity that according to some stories the 7th Doctor was aware of its existence. And the second one is that, well, the Daleks are the Daleks. Their entire motivation is to become the most dominant power in the universe, and given that the Time Lords are more than powerful enough to pose a threat to that dominance, it's kind of inevitable that these two would come to blows. However, for the sake of argument, is there a way we can try and prevent the Time War, or at the very least prolong the time it takes for a war to break out? Well, in order to do so, I believe one key event has to change. The Time Lords don't send the Doctor to Skaro to avert the Daleks' creation. For some reason, they just decide the whole thing isn't a good idea, meaning that yes, Genesis of the Daleks never occurs, at least not how we know it. Now, why is this important? Well, it's been stated by multiple sources, including Russell T Davies himself, that Genesis of the Daleks kind of acted as the impetus for the Time War, with the Time Strategist Dalek even claiming that the mission made it so from the Daleks' earliest beginnings they sought time travel and time weaponry. It is stated in Genesis that the Doctor's actions set the Daleks' development back about 1,000 years, so while it is possible that the Time Lords' inaction here could have prevented war a little longer, a likely side effect would be that as a result of the Daleks not being set back, they advance much faster than they do in the main timeline, especially considering that without this event, it's possible that the Movellans would never come to be, as the Time Lords predicted that the Doctor's success would give rise to a race of synthetic robots capable of bringing about the downfall of the Dalek Empire. So it's possible that destiny of the Daleks and the entire Movellan War as a result would have never occurred, which also probably creates its own branches, but the main point of it is the Movellan virus also wouldn't have caused such a large collapse in the Dalek Empire, meaning that the Daleks likely wouldn't have had a civil war, as the fracturing of the Empire and the creation of new factions was key to that conflict. I'd imagine that the Daleks would still desire the Hand of Omega though, so I imagine they'd still attempt to retrieve it, only this time it would be one united Dalek faction rather than two opposing ones. Assuming that the Doctor still destroys Gallifrey over this though, I'd imagine this only increases anti-Time Lord sentiment amongst the Daleks, leading them to advance even faster technologically in preparation for a war. All of this raises an interesting question though. What would happen to Davros? After all, he was revived in Destiny of the Daleks to aid the Daleks in their war with the Movellans, and was a key factor in the Dalek Civil War as he created Daleks that had mutated beyond the originals, later dubbed Renegades, and that were more loyal to him. Well, I'd imagine in this alternate timeline one of two things could occur. Either he would have just remained dead after the events of Genesis of the Daleks, as even without the Doctor's involvement I'd imagine the Daleks would reach a similar conclusion, or the Daleks treat him as a pet far sooner, as they did in Stolen Earth and Journey's End, as these more advanced Daleks may see him as having some use in his knowledge, as well as perhaps using him as a test subject for new technology. This is personally the avenue I'd go down, as I think it's more interesting to keep Davros alive, but I'd be interested to hear your suggestions as to what could happen to Davros in this alternate timeline in the comments section below. All of this is to say, however, that the Daleks' later history would become much more prosperous and united than it was in the original timeline, and as a result, a conflict between the Time Lords and Daleks would be a lot less balanced than it was in our timeline. And yeah, I do think there would eventually be a conflict between the two. As I said in the beginning of the video, the Daleks' desire to become the ultimate power in the universe was always going to lead to conflict, especially with the Time Lords. But I think the circumstances of said war would be very different. For example, in most media it's generally agreed upon that the Daleks were the ones to officially begin the Time War, as it's stated in Parting of the Ways that the Daleks had, quote, gone off to fight a bigger war, thus ending the 10th Dalek occupation. However, in this alternate timeline, I believe it's entirely possible that the Time Lords, fearing the growing power of the Daleks, would be the ones to throw the first punch, further justifying Dalek belief that the Time Lords were out to get them, and as such were unfit to govern time. Now, as stated before, I said that the circumstances of this war would be very different. I believe that the Daleks' power being totally unobstructed throughout history would have led to them absolutely dominating a new Time War, especially considering that I could actually imagine the Daleks having more allies in this timeline, considering that the Time Lords for a certain point of view would have been seen as the aggressors, what with the destruction of Skaro and the declaration of war. And if that sounds too far-fetched, keep in mind that instead, in the later years of the Time War, that the difference between Time Lords and Daleks became pretty negligible. As a result of all of this, I think the Time War would just hit the Time Lords, and by extension the Doctor, too suddenly for them to respond effectively, or even use the moment, as that was done to end the ages of suffering that had been endured up until that point. And I think by the time it got to that point, it would already be too late, and the universe would be in the hands, or I guess plungers, of the Dalek Empire. And upon such a victory, I'd imagine the Daleks would break off any alliance they had left with any other species, and attempt to eradicate them as soon as possible, because, well, they're the Daleks. But what would the universe be like after a Dalek victory? Honestly, I'm not too sure, as this is already so far removed from the timeline that we know, with so many alternate conflicts, that events become increasingly harder to predict. But feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments below. I realise this is quite different from the content I've made previously, but I wanted to try something new, and thought it would be fun to try and combine one of my favourite genres of fiction with one of my favourite fictional properties, to see what interesting scenarios could come out of it. I'm also aware, given the sheer amount of Doctor Who content that exists, it's likely that there's one story out there that somehow contradicts the timeline I've created, but I've tried to use a good balance of expanded media and the main show in order to form the basis of this thought experiment. But you know, I'm not Davis, so please don't be too harsh in the comments. If you like this content though and you want to see more like it, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.
Shout out to Debs Iona, Shane Smith, Ree Keffin, Seb Lowndes, Jay Monroe, Hash Shandycoot, Patrick Mewson, Simon Ashley, Steve Safaro, Andrew Townsend, Alex Robbins, Michael Dykes, Paul Bryden, Sam Yates, Michael Rhodes, Jerry the Meerkat, Heretic, Cameron Jefferson, John M, Andrew Evanson, JM97, Gallifreyan Rob, Cliff's Random Silliness, Kyle McCroy, Nova Wolf Gaming, Carol Jude, Mr. KNL, Autumn Matthews, Josh Rocks 123, The Raggedy Jedi, Upmixed Time Lord. If you want to become a member, feel free to do so. It really helps out. You get exclusive posts, shout outs in every video, and even your own badge and custom emojis to use.